Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to this episode of the Greatest Profession podcast. My name is Matt Ashudo. I'm your host. Still am. Still around. Still me, guys. This episode is featuring Dr. Katherine Fogelberg. Gosh, what a... I don't know. I swear, having this booth was so lucky. I just got to meet so many interesting people, and Dr. Fogelberg is absolutely one of them. What's funny is that the way that the booth was sort of set up is that on one side was sort of a, hey, let's interact with you type of space. And the other side was, hey, you do you. And we had a bunch of like games and things. We had Connect Four and Jenga and Hungry Hippos. And it's like in coloring books and, just like, hey, connect to your childhood a little bit if you want to. And then I'm not going to bother you over there. So she came by and she was taking pictures of the Hungry Hippos to basically prove to some of the people that she worked with in Kenya that it exists. So that's the beginning of that. Dr. Fogelberg is actually a associate dean at Virginia Tech or Virginia, Maryland, which I didn't know were the same. I didn't know that. I didn't know. But anyway, so that she's an associate dean there. And, we just got to talking. I'm like, and she's one that I'm like, please, would you mind kind of doing a little bit of a leap of faith here and then talking to me, again, a stranger on this podcast? And she said, yes, graciously. This conversation kind of goes, all over the place. She has such a varied background, and like how she kind of got into veterinary medicine was both a childhood dream and also something that she stumbled into, or sort of like after the fact, which is a really interesting sort of combination to me. But primarily through all of it, there has been this link of education. And so, we talk about all that stuff. We actually don't even get to the point where we get to talk about the nonprofit that she has in Kenya, or working in Kenya, or I didn't get to ask about it because we were talking about so many other things. So I'm probably gonna have to bother her again just so we can have like this little mini episode of like, so what is this work that you're doing? I do know that it is, I believe it's pronounced Msomi, MSOMI, Academy for Girls, and effectively it's empowering girls, I presume, in Kenya, or empowering young girls to, through education. Again, this sort of power of education. It's drawing that line through, which I find super fascinating. We just didn't get to it. Man. But anyway, so I definitely learned a lot, and super interested in her story. The other thing that I did want to sort of mention is that they also, or Dr. Fogelberg is also a part of a podcast that was recently started called Reflections in Veterinary Education, where effectively 3 veterinary education nerds or education nerds get to sort of talk and nerd out about education, which, by the way, I did listen to a couple episodes, and it turns out I'm one of them. I didn't quite realize, but I'm a nerd in education as well. Like, why couldn't I be the nerd, like the Marvel one, like Magic the Gathering, Dungeons and Dragons, things that like now have come around and been like, yeah, obviously. No, I'm still like organic chemistry, education. Why does the string of the guitar look like that? I'm still oh no, you're a nerd. But anyway, so this is my conversation with Katherine Fogelberg in what I presume is part 1 of, I'm hoping, many. There's just so much more that I wish that we were able to get to. But yeah, if you guys, by the way, this podcast is still sort of running just off of word of mouth. Therefore, keep on spreading the word. I appreciate so much all the feedback that I've been getting, and all of you guys who have, spread it. And every time it kind of goes a little bit further, I get more feedback that sort of says, hey, you know what? Yeah, you keep doing this, which is really nice. Again, so I don't feel super insane sitting in my quasi basement recording these episodes. it's good. It's good. It's good for me. So I definitely appreciate it. We're on all the platforms. We are on YouTube as well. I am trying to update that as much as possible. But yeah, that's all of it. So thank you guys again. Get ready. Here we are, this episode with Katherine Fogelberg. Yeah, and look, you got so many books. Like, you look like you're well read.
No, it's all for show. Because here's the thing: I also have Hey the chicken, who screams if you squeeze him. He's lovely. He's awesome. So.
It's pretty well centered, I have to say. The chicken right on top.
He's an important part of my day. I can't.
I surround myself with musical instruments, and then so like on this wall is like Tintin, which was when I was growing up, it was the comic book thing that my mom and I hunted down before Amazon was a thing.
Yeah.
And then, these are paintings that my friend did. And then just, musical instruments scattered all about.
Very cool. Well, I was a professional musician in a prior life, so I can fully appreciate that.
Were you really?
Yeah, I was.
How prior of a life? What are we talking about?
I guess it was my first profession other than being a student.
Okay.
I actually went to undergrad as a music major, performance major. I was there on a music scholarship.
Wow.
Was in the marching band and did, symphony orchestra, and then played in a pit orchestra, and then went into the Army for music. So I was a musician there for 3 years.
No way. That's awesome. What instrument?
Flute. Yeah.
Man, that is so impressive to me. It's like I surround myself with it, and then I know that I'm incredibly mediocre.
I was also incredibly mediocre, so that's okay.
Just hide me in the middle. I'll just pretend.
Exactly right, yeah.
I have one of my best friends. I've known him since third grade. He's like the smartest person that I know. He went to Harvard and like casually was valedictorian or whatever. I mean, he's one of those guys. And then after all that, he's like, you know what? I really miss music. I mean, that was the thing that he was doing all throughout, and that was the thing that made him happy. Yeah. So he went back and he got his master's in performance, and that's what he does now.
That's awesome.
It's fantastic.
Yeah.
And every time he lives in New York, because of course he does. And
right. Because where else would you live if you had a master's in music performance?
Yeah. And whenever I go, he always has these. I mean, he chooses things that are interesting to him, right? Like he could go and play, I don't know, whatever. But he's like, yeah, there's this really interesting like social justice piece that was written by a Cuban American, blah blah blah, and I'm going to go play it in a park. And I'm like, okay. And then he'll do Carnegie Hall or whatever. It's like, what is happening?
Yeah. So I watch these commercials for, I don't remember what university it is, but they're always like, they show this person who's at commencement who's supposedly giving this inspiring graduation speech, and he's like, talent is equally distributed, and I'm like, no, that's BS. It is not equally distributed. I know far too many people who are incredibly beautiful, can speak 12 languages, are freaking Mensa members, and oh, by the way, also play an instrument and can make money at it. Like, sorry, talent is not equally distributed.
Yeah, exactly.
Not that I'm cynical or bitter or anything.
Yeah. Just let me piddle away at with my like mediocre talent.
Right? Exactly. So.
Wow. Yeah, that is a very misinformed individual. Talent is equally distributed, and also I don't know anybody.
That's right. Yeah. I have an N of 1.
Yeah. So then how did you get into music? I mean, to the point that you are entering the military for music? I mean, how did all that happen?
Well, I mean, to be fair, I followed a boy into the military. That's never a good thing to do. No, so I actually wanted to be a veterinarian when I was younger. I did not grow up in a particularly happy home, but one of the few things that did happen was I was introduced to veterinary medicine through a summer camp that my mother run. It's a whole other story. And oddly enough, the veterinarian was castrating a dog, and I was like, I want to do that. So I know, terrifying, right? And to this day, castrations are still my favorite surgery because they're easy and they're very rewarding. But anyway, so yeah, and then when I went through school, we actually weren't allowed to start playing an instrument until I was in middle school, which was 6th grade for me.
Okay.
And my parents were divorced, but my dad had actually taken me to Ravinia Park in Chicago to hear a live performance of James James Galway, who, for those who don't know, James Galway was sort of one of the premier professional flautists in the day when I was in first grade, way back when, I won't say exactly. And I knew at that moment that I also wanted to play the flute. And so I, ended up being able to play that instrument in sixth grade, and then discovered that I didn't think I was going to be really good at surgery or good with surgery, because I would watch these videos in biology of them doing like open heart surgery, and I was getting a little woozy, and I was like, that's probably not a good sign. That in combination with my mother constantly telling me I was too dumb to be a veterinarian then led me to realize that I was actually I was better than mediocre as a new musician, not as a professional musician. And so, I ended up going to school as a professional, pursuing music actually as my career.
Wow.
And I found out really quickly that was a bad decision, because I have terrible stage fright, and I really don't like people staring at me. So
that's
I was great at being in an ensemble, but the whole audition process, no.
Right. Wow. So then during that process, where did veterinary medicine land in your psyche? Was it still like, hey, yeah, maybe, or is it like a long dream that was like on a raft somewhere and you're just reaching for it, like, please, one day?
Yeah, it was the latter.
Huh.
It was the latter. I definitely, I graduated. My high school had about 330 students in it, and I think I graduated in the top 6% of my class. I wasn't necessarily stupid, but once again, I wasn't quite, the best. And I came from a fairly poor family and those kinds of things. I mean, they were educated. My mom and dad both had degrees, and that was just expected that we would go to school too. But just, growing up with years of somebody sort of telling you you're not smart enough. And primarily it was because I was not great at math. I mean, I was competent at math, but the only C I got in high school was in geometry, which, let's face it, how much geometry do you use in veterinary medicine? But I didn't know that.
I totally get it. I love math. I love it, but I hated geometry. I was so bad at it.
What's up with those proofs? Who cares? Somebody already proved it. I don't need to prove it to you again. Right? Like, seriously, it's ridiculous. But
yeah.
I guess it does come in handy sometimes. Not the proofs, but anyway, that's how it kind of ended up. And so, I went to school to be a music major, and then, met a boy, followed him into the Army. So I was a professional musician for a while, but realized that really wasn't my calling. And music's one of those things that, it's great to do as a hobby, but unless you're really, really good, you're not going to make a living at it.
Right. Yeah. And willing to kind of do the ridiculous stuff too, right? Yeah. Like the traveling and the playing in this thing in the middle of Montana or whatever. Right. And
yeah.
You're always gigging, which when I was growing up, that was sort of the thing that I sort of had two avenues. One is that I can follow the arts, be it, acting or music or whatever, or two, I could follow the sciences. And it's like, I didn't want to consistently or constantly audition for the rest of my life. What's funny is that now I do relief, and it's basically the same idea.
That's true, because every time you go out on the stage, it's basically an audition.
Yes. Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So I don't know. It's the big cosmic joke, I suppose. But yeah.
I think that's amazing.
It's yeah. I'm glad for the path that I took. I don't, of course there was no other way for me to get here. Right. But I learned a lot of things on the way that have served me in every one of those steps. Yeah,
absolutely. I agree. I'm very curious about the whole stand-up comedian thing.
Well, so similarly, I never actually did like the stand-up thing, which is like, hey, you as a human being just by yourself, go stand on that stage and make this audience laugh. Mm-hmm. Like, I felt like that was too presumptuous of me. But what I did do is I did improv forever, which is like the key difference, right? Is you're a part of an ensemble.
Sure.
So
Yep.
Much to your point, it's like it's this interesting game of like setting up the other person, or if you do happen to be the one who says the amazing line or whatever, it's because someone set you up. And it's like, we're in this together. Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And you can disappear into the ensemble a little bit that way. So you're less self-conscious about it, for sure.
And you did that before you went to vet school?
Mm-hmm, yeah.
I got back to it after. So I'm really interested in how you ended up in vet school.
Yeah, me too. I followed a girl.
Oh, really?
Yeah, yeah.
Oh, wow.
The places we go, right?
Yeah, yeah. Stupid things we do.
Yeah. I let's see, I did improv for a long time. So I did it in high school. Like my friends had to force me to do it. And then when I went to college, I don't know, I expected college to be this like really amazing philosophical, academic, like spiritual experience. And it was just not.
I
And
was like, you have really high
I
expectations. You were
really
very
did.
disappointed, weren't you?
Yes, because my high school, I had like there were probably 20 or 25 people that were to this day still the smartest people that I know.
Mm.
Just amazing. It was just an amazing kind of group that were. I don't know. We had enough independence that we could kind of go out and stare up at the stars and philosophize about life and all that kind of stuff. But then, we're all like relatively responsible individuals. So we never like got into that much trouble. I don't know. I'm like, if this is high school, it can only get better. And it didn't. So yeah, so I think that when I was in college, I was longing for some piece of the life I led before,
Mhm.
just to attach myself back to who I was because I felt so lost.
Mhm.
And then there was a improv company in San Diego that was auditioning for their main troupe, and so I auditioned. I got in, and I spent several years not doing very well until
We all have to go through that.
you have to, and man, you forget now, but yeah, at the time it was just torture, and
Wow.
every rehearsal for I want to say about a year and a half, I was like dreading because I'm like, I am so bad at this.
Aw. Aw.
But I mean, you have to do it, right? So,
Yeah.
but anyway, so then at some point it kind of clicked, and then from there it was probably 4.5 years, beyond that, where that was my job, and I was performing like 4 to 5 shows a week, and
Wow.
you do the corporate events and all
Yeah.
that kind of stuff. So it was awesome. It was
Yeah.
fantastic.
Very cool.
Yeah, and then I went to Chicago, and then I did Second City and Improv Olympic and all that stuff there, which was just a whole new way of doing it. I taught a bunch in between. I actually taught improv at high schools for a while. But yeah, so my history with improv is I have a lot of it, and I
Yeah.
learned so much about life from that.
That's fantastic. And then you met a girl and you went to that school.
Yeah, I met the girl early. So when I was 20, we actually met. She owned a dance studio, and I saw this ad in the paper. I'm like sitting outside of my high school because I went to college in my hometown, right? Which is like I think a mistake in retrospect. So I'm like sitting outside of my high school and looking, longingly, like nostalgic for the days. And I open up the La Jolla Light, which is like the local paper, and the ad says dance instructor wanted, no experience necessary. I'm like, well, that's me.
Improv, right? Improv.
Yeah, exactly. So yeah, I applied, and then she happened to own the clinic or the studio, and then I like courted her basically for about a year until she finally like succumbed.
You beat her into submission.
Yeah, exactly. But yeah, we were together for 12 years. And then eventually, so she ended up wanting to go to vet school, and I'm like, yeah, sure, why not? So she went the year before me, and then the relationship actually sort of ended right as vet school ended.
Oh, I'm sorry.
But yeah, I mean, I guess that's how it goes, We're still friends. I mean, she's a very good. She's effectively like a core human to my story, right? Like who I am as a person. Sure. So anyway, so that's my story.
That's great.
Yeah. So then similarly, right? Like how, it's not necessarily a logical step from like music, military, back into veterinary medicine.
What? Yeah, it's perfectly logical.
One day I was out in the field playing the flute, and I saw a cow, and I'm like, you know what?
Yeah, I was like, that was my moment.
Right.
Yeah, no. So obviously, the boy that I followed into the military, we did not stay together, which was a good thing for a number of reasons. And I, again, realized really quickly that I loved music, but it wasn't sustainable for me. I also realized very quickly that I didn't necessarily want to stay in the military. And that sort of led me to this idea of, well, I should probably try to go to vet school again. So I ended up applying for a scholarship called Green to Gold, which allowed enlisted soldiers to get their undergraduate degrees paid for if they went through ROTC, and then repaid that through a commission back onto active duty.
Okay.
And so I received that scholarship after my first 3 years as an enlisted soldier, and went back to school and went back as an animal science major. And then I had this grand plan, right? I had this grand plan. I was going to go back. I was going to, because there was an opportunity if you were going to get, like, if you got into medical school or veterinary school or dental school or some kind of professional program, you could apply for basically a delayed entry into your commission. And then you could go to your professional program, and then you would get commissioned back on in whatever profession you were. So I was like, okay, well, I'll just do that, right?
Sure.
So I actually attended the University of Hawaii at Manoa, and they were a contract school with Colorado State University. And so I was like, oh, this is perfect. You know, I grew up in Colorado. I always wanted to go to Colorado State. This will be great. Yeah. Applied and did not get accepted. And I will be honest with you, I was pretty crushed. And the reasons that they gave me were not particularly good reasons. I think there were other things going on.
Like, what did they say?
Well, I mean, I basically asked them, you know, can you help me understand? Because I was a leader within ROTC within my battalion, which had about 250 cadets that, you know, I had some leadership roles in. I was volunteering at the local Humane Society. I was volunteering to give undergraduate high school campus tours. I was a member of the pre-veterinary club. Like, I had all of these extracurricular activities, right?
Wow, yeah.
And then I had I think my GPA at the time was like around 3.6, and I had, you know, pretty solid GRE score and things like that. And they basically told me, well, you don't have enough extracurricular activities. And I was like, okay, because I was older when I went back, you know, I was 25, 26 years old by the time I went back and got my degree. So, so that was frustrating. And then I found out that a friend of mine she was a lovely human, but her application probably wasn't quite as strong numbers wise as mine was, but she had been accepted to Colorado State. And so, you know, we're having this conversation, and then what it turned out really was that they didn't know how to classify me because I was in Hawaii, and because I was still considered military, I should have been qualified as an in-state and WICHE applicant, but they basically told me I was homeless and said that they didn't consider me a resident of Hawaii, but they also didn't consider me a resident of Colorado. And so that actually put me into the out-of-state applicant pool. And anybody who knows anything about Colorado State's out-of-state applicant pool knows that if you're not in the top 1%, you're not getting accepted. Yeah. And I was not in the top 1%, you know. So that whole story aside, I do that. Sorry. Squirrel.
No, that's all right. That should be the name of the podcast.
Right. Yeah. So anyway, I didn't get accepted, and that was the only program I had applied to that year. And so I had one more year to apply, and I applied the following year, but I was still sort of stinging because, you know, you're young and you don't always figure these things out. And so I sort of half-heartedly attempted to apply to Colorado State and one other school. Sadly, most of my criteria involved how many schools can I apply to that don't require a second semester of physics. So there were only like 3. And I didn't get into any of them again. And so I had to go back onto active duty. And I promise there's a story, an end to this story. So I didn't get back. I didn't get accepted. So I had to go on to active duty, and I had to pay back my obligation. And so I got back on active duty. I ended up going in as a medical service corps officer, which is basically hospital administration, but for the people side of things. And so I spent a couple of years at Fort Lewis, Washington as an ambulance platoon leader. And I was like, oh, well, maybe I'll go to PA school because they have a really good PA program in the military. And I had lots of friends who were PAs. And I went and did some on-the-job training and shadowing, and actually ended up getting accepted to the PA program, and then transferred down to San Antonio, which is where the PA school was located. And before I transferred down, realized I did not want to work on people. That was just not going to make me happy. Also realized that I did not want to make the military a career, and based on the payback, I would have had to do that. So they ended up, after some very angry conversations, reassigning me to a place called the Defense Medical Training. I have a really good track record of making so Defense Medical Readiness Training Institute, or DMRTI, and they were the people who administered a course called the Combat Casualty Care Course. and C4 for short. And basically, it was a 56 CME credit hour granting course that was an in-residence course for all of the military medical providers, and we trained them to do their battlefield mission. Oh. And so I discovered then that I really loved curriculum, because they had a 20-year-old curriculum when I took that over. And so I got in there and I got to like revamp the curriculum and updo it. And I was like, oh, this is really cool. And I've got to figure out what I want to do with my life when I get out, because I'm getting out and I don't really know what I'm going to do. So I ended up getting my master's degree in education, thinking that I was going to get out and teach. Realized during that process that high schoolers really scared me, and I didn't know if that was going to work out, but that's a whole other story. So anyway, I'm having this conversation with my boss. He was the officer in charge of the C4 course. And I don't know what happened, but one day we're having this conversation, and I was telling him about, how I was planning to get out, because he knew. And he's like, well, what are you going to do when you get out? I was like, well, I'll probably go teach, but I don't really know. And he's like, well, what did you want to do when you grew up? And I was like, well, I always wanted to be a veterinarian. And he's like, okay, well, why aren't you a veterinarian? I'm like, well, I didn't get into vet school. And he's like, okay, so why aren't you a veterinarian? I'm like, well, I didn't get into vet school, right? So we had that whole conversation, and he was like, well, that's stupid. You should try again, is essentially what it ended up being. And I was like, challenge accepted. So I ended up having to take a second semester of physics.
Oh, no.
I did it by correspondence course.
Okay.
Are you familiar with correspondence courses?
No, not really. I mean, because now it's like all online and that type of thing. But back then, right, isn't it like, in a in 2015 era, it was like, don't they send you tests and stuff like that?
Yes, and that's exactly right. So I'm aging myself. But so I essentially enrolled in this course and did it by correspondence course. And the professor snail mailed me my assignments. Right. I did my assignments, and then I snail mailed the assignments back to him. And then he snail mailed me the corrected assignment and the next assignment. And this is sort of how it proceeded until I got to. So I basically taught myself my second semester of physics. And then when I needed to take an exam, he would snail mail it to the testing center, and I would just make arrangements to go and be proctored to take the exam. Right. And so, so I had to take my second semester of physics by snail mail. I got a B-. You would never be, you've never seen somebody so happy to get a 40, like 40. I think I got a 44% on my final exam. I only needed a 42%. So I was pretty excited to get my B-. So that's all I needed. So I ended up completing just a couple of prerequisites that I was lacking, physics being one of them, and applied to Texas A&M in Wisconsin. At the time I was married, and the man I was married to was from Wisconsin. And so I applied to those programs and was accepted to both of those programs.
Man, so each time you only applied to very few schools.
I did. Yeah.
One, then two, then two.
Yep. Very few.
That's wild.
Yeah, which was probably not a great plan in retrospect. But,
yeah, especially because like the admissions process is basically witchcraft a little.
Yeah. No, it's gotten much better now, I think. I don't know when you went to vet school, and now I'm on the side where I understand that process a little bit better, but it's definitely evolved. So.
Yeah, I feel like I graduated in 2017, so I also went back late, right? Because I had this whole other thing that I was doing. But yeah, at that time, I didn't have any clinical experience, luckily, and I only applied to one school because it was also sort of like on a whim kind of. I didn't know it was supposed to be hard to get in, right?
No, that's probably good. That probably played in your favor.
It probably did. Yeah. I went to the interview, we laughed the whole time, and then
there you go.
And then I got in.
Perfect.
Yeah. But I don't know. But I do know that it's in talking to a lot of people that are, veterinarians and incredibly smart, and all that. It's really difficult to sort of say all right, these people are going to do really well in this program and to be good veterinarians.
Yes.
Without, I don't know. It's you want to get people who are not necessarily traditional quote unquote applicants. I was a non-traditional applicant. It just so happened at the University of Tennessee at the time, they didn't care about some of these other things. So I got it on my academic merits.
I doubt that very seriously. I'm sure there was a lot of other things involved. But.
Who knows? I have no idea. But I definitely have gotten, through the years, I'm really me and not this person?
Yeah.
And like I said, if I didn't get in, I would have done something else. But it does seem that's the moral of the story is just keep applying. If that's the thing that you want to do, just do it until you do it.
Yeah, I mean, we had that's the thing, I tell applicants, and I'm not the admissions person at my school, but the thing about it is that in any given year, the number of applicants that are actually qualified and would be successful in a program is far, far greater than the number of seats available. And so it really is just, I've heard people who are admissions committees say, I could literally close my eyes, reach my hand in, pull out a bunch of packets, and they would probably be fine, right? There are other things, obviously, that we're looking for, but I certainly think that's the case. And so for people who are really, really committed to it, we had a guy in my class who had applied 6 times, and he finally got in off the wait list. And he was a phenomenal individual, phenomenal veterinarian, just like this amazing person, right? But got waitlisted and didn't even get in for like 6 years. And so, yeah, I mean, I think that just supports this idea that there are just so many more people interested in being veterinarians and actually get the opportunity. And it's really sad in a lot of ways.
Yeah. And what I'm finding on the sort of other side of school is that once you get into the veterinary medicine thing, practicing medicine, what makes you successful as a veterinarian is not necessarily, those are not the same skills necessarily that like helps you get through the academic piece of vet school.
Yeah. Absolutely right. Yeah. And I think, there's been a huge shift. I mean, I graduated in 2008, and there's been this huge shift even since I graduated, which I can't believe is now 15 years ago. But that to understanding that those soft skills are not soft skills, right? They're the skills that are actually going to make or break you in practice, make or break you in your career, because there were certainly people I graduated with, and you probably had the same experience, who graduated at the top of the class, but there's no way I would ever refer a client to them because they don't know how to communicate. They think they know everything. So they're mistake prone because they refuse to believe that they don't know everything or, go to a book. They don't know how to ask for help. Like they don't do all the things that you need to do to really be a successful human, number one, but professional for sure, number two. And so that's where this idea of we no longer are looking for the student who has a 4.0 GPA and that's it. We're looking for that student who maybe has a 3.5 or even a 3.2 GPA, but has faced some hardship, has demonstrated some resiliency, understands sort of the world and the way it works, and has a little bit of understanding of the profession. Now, that's not all of our students, obviously, but those are the ones who are snapped up pretty quickly by most schools.
Oh, that's interesting. Yeah. So then you're right. I mean, that does sound different. I think that there's, there was a shift sort of around the time when I was in school, or at least that's how it seemed based on the conversations with like the dean, is that they were trying to focus more and more on that. And you could see with every class that sort of the evidence of what they were trying, right? It's like, well, this class is very, it's like they're not great at, this thing, but they're really strong at this other thing. Right. Yeah. That's interesting. So then, but then going back to when you were doing Defense Ready Medical Readiness Training Institute.
MRTI.
So like, I mean, first off, you got involved in this somehow, right? Like, how did you even get like sucked into the vortex, and how did you get into the position where you were revamping a curriculum that's 20 years old?
Stupid luck, I think. Yeah, like I said, I was supposed to go there and go to PA school. And then when I decided I didn't want to go to PA school, the orders had already been cut for me to move to San Antonio. And so I moved there and they had to find a place for me. And so they ended up needing somebody in this position, which was technically was the officer in charge of training for the Defense Medical Readiness Training Institute. Someday I'm going to have a job that actually has a short name. But yeah.
Right.
Vet. So just something that I don't have to explain. That's like short and sweet.
Right.
So I was a fairly strong performer as a cadet, and so I ended up getting my first choice of commission branches, which was Medical Service Corps. And I guess they just needed somebody, and they stuck me in there, which again, it did end up being kind of a stupid, happy accident. My boss was a PA, really, really smart guy. And the whole organization was run by physicians who were obviously officers. And so it was a tri-service branch. We served Army, Navy, and Air Force. And so on my staff, I had Army, Navy, and Air Force enlisted soldiers, airmen, and sailors.
Wow.
Easy. And they were actually the instructors. But when I dug into it, so this was in the late 90s, early 2000s. And at that time, the curriculum was teaching basically doctrine based on what we call a linear battlefield, right? This idea that you have sort of these really fairly, I guess, I'm losing my words. There are these lines of demarcation between us and them, right? There's this, from this side here is, well, people aren't going to be able to see that, but from one side back, there's right? There's friendly people, and then on the other side of that line in the sand, then it's the enemy, and that's sort of what you see in the war movies and that kind of thing. Yeah. But at that point in time, the battlefield was changing to where it was more urban warfare, right? So we were getting involved in the Middle East. We were starting to have conflicts in places where the woman down the street or the baby could potentially have a weapon, and you didn't know that. And that's not what we were teaching to our folks who were coming through. And so we were teaching them their medical mission on the battlefield, which is very different than the medical mission in the hospital, right? So the medical mission in the hospital is very much about saving everybody, throwing all kinds of, resources at every individual, pulling all those life-saving measures. And that's what a lot of the folks who came through my program went into medicine to do. But your battlefield mission is you do the most good for the most people. Right. You distribute those resources in a way that you can save the most people and potentially, decrease the suffering. And that means that you have an expectant category in triage, which is not something that you have in the hospital. And so when I was looking at this, the other part of that is that they needed to be able to protect themselves and be able to understand how to put on their PPE, how to decontaminate themselves, how to manage casualties at the point of injury. So we taught them care management from point of injury all the way up to level 2, which is sort of just below that level 3 trauma center. Okay. And when I was looking at it, we were teaching them this linear battlefield. Sorry, talk all over the place, but we were teaching them this linear battlefield, and we were moving into urban warfare, and we needed to update our doctrine because we were not preparing them for success when they got deployed. And so, I went to my boss and I was like, listen, I'm digging into this and it looks like we're teaching some really outdated doctrine and I'm concerned about that. And he's like, okay, we'll go fix it. Right. Cause that's how my boss was. He treated me like an adult, which was amazing. I often say that if my last boss in the military had been my first boss, I probably would have made a career out of it. So, so I went in and I had to update stuff. And because it was a 9-day in-residence course, the first 2 days were dedicated to them earning their certification in either basic trauma life support, pre-hospital trauma life support, or advanced trauma life support. And so depending on sort of what their role was. So I actually became a pre-hospital trauma life support instructor and then instructor trainer. So I was actually teaching this stuff before I even had a medical degree. So I was prepared. Not really. Right. But and so anyway, he let me get in there and really dig it around. The rest of it was really delivered in the field, and it was very, sort of what we would call inquiry based in education speak, which was they were sitting in there, they were getting instruction, they were involved in actual hands-on, engaged learning, and then they would do what we called an FTX or field training exercise for the last 48 hours, where we did simulated lanes and simulated scenarios that involved moulaged patients and, other sort of disasters that they might encounter. And that a lot of that changed because of the way the battlefield had changed. So I got in there and dug around in that, and it was really cool. I was like, this is really cool, right? Like I get to update things and research and figure out what's good and what's not and why this is so important, and then create this thing that I get to go and deliver to people. And it was just really rewarding. And so that's I don't even remember what your question was, but that's how that ended up.
I mean, you answered it. So it's irrelevant what it was. It's interesting. Like when I think of a large institution, like, the armed forces or like an academic institution or anything like that, I just, to make any changes always seems so insurmountable. And there's oftentimes a pressure of like, well, this is how we've always done it. This is how we're going to keep doing it. So hush now, young one. And it's like, it's kind of amazing, especially for your boss to be like, yeah, okay, great. Yeah. Go do it. That's pretty fantastic.
Yeah. I mean, I was really lucky, right? He was my direct boss. And then we had folks over us who were also quite willing to listen to somebody who at least was able to put a coherent sentence together. I think, there are lots of people in the military who are very bright, but there are also lots of people in the military who are not very bright, and oftentimes they end up in leadership roles. So, I think that's I was very lucky that I had a strong, smart leadership team from sort of my direct person all the way up. And so, I also think it's common sense, right, that you don't want to be teaching outdated doctrine because you want to prepare, especially your healthcare providers, to be successful. But it was way too easy, I think, in many ways, because now I'm in academia and it's much harder. But yeah, it's great. I loved it. I had so much fun. I
Okay.
mean, I did not enjoy the 40-hour shifts that I had to pull several times, probably. I think over the course of the 2 years I was there, I think I pulled 40-hour shifts. And so, yet another thing that prepared me for vet school. But
Oh, wow.
it was
Yeah. So, so then after all of this, I mean, like you
I did.
did end up going to vet school and you did end up practicing medicine, but you were like, but you seem to have a passion for education. And obviously, like that's kind of where the
Yeah.
story comes back to, is that you get back into education. But when you practice, like, did you find yourself missing it? Did you find yourself like fulfilling your dream and so you were happy, or
No,
how
I
did
hated
that all
I hated
feel?
clinical practice. I actually knew I was going to hate clinical practice. I
Oh,
never wanted to go into clinical practice. If you talk to any of my classmates, they'd be like, "I can't believe Fogelberg went into clinical practice. That she never wanted to do clinical practice, right?" I was very vocal about it. I'm sure that surprises you.
right.
So I, yeah, yeah. No, when I went to vet school, I already had my master's degree in education. I was, had sort of my second career. I was engaging in my third or fourth career at that point. And I really actually struggled quite a bit in vet school. It was not easy for me. Part of it was because, and this is not to be arrogant, but I think this is true of a lot of vet students, that I just didn't study that much when I was an undergrad. I didn't have to study that much as an undergrad. And when you get to
Right.
vet school, again, unless you're in that
Yep.
top 1 to 5%, you got to study, right? Or you're not going to get through it. And I didn't know how to study because I
Mm-hmm.
never had to. And so I struggled with that. But I also, I had some
Sure.
mental health issues, which were probably unmanaged and I didn't address very well, just sort of based on childhood and other things that had happened. And then I also had this frustration with the way that my education was being delivered to me. And anybody who's been, it doesn't have to be vet school, anybody who's been to college or even sometimes high school understands that teachers are not always great, but it's particularly common in higher education to have poor teaching. And that's because they just aren't taught how to be teachers. And that's, I think the vast majority of instructors, teachers who go into higher education really want to be good teachers, but they're not ever taught how to do that. And so they do what was done to them, or they figure out this isn't right and they go out on their own, but they have to sort of learn a whole new profession, because it really is another profession and it's another discipline that you have to learn. And so I had sort of this perfect storm.
Man, yeah, I was talking to the dean about that exact thing.
No.
Sorry. Yeah, I was just saying, like, I was talking to the dean about that exact same thing. It's like I think at the University of Tennessee, at least at the time, they were like these master class something or another's, where basically like master teacher session. So you'd like go and you have to like opt into it, right? Like you have to show up and you have to spend your time to go learn how to be a more effective teacher. And it's like, understandably, especially for academics who have to sit on a number of committees and who have like their clinical duties and have their teaching and whatever, it's like the numbers would dwindle over time. Yeah. I mean, absolutely. And I actually wrote this thing when I was graduating vet school. It's like an 8-page, basically a proposal to the dean, encouraged by the assistant dean, who was always like, yeah, I mean, we would love to have you as a teacher and blah, blah, blah. And like the conceit of the proposal was that, we put someone in front of a group of people, basically an audience, and then pretend that this isn't theater. And like, this is theater. Like, if you can't deliver the information in a captivating way, then you're not going to be able to teach people.
Yeah. So. And I think there's a lot to be said for. I actually took a very brief workshop on improv, believe it or not, by a medical improv instructor. So we can talk about that some other time. But I think it's this idea that, I have faculty who sometimes come to me and say, well, I'm so annoyed at these lazy kids. They don't want to come to class. They don't want to do this. They don't want to do that. They just want to watch it on double speed, on lecture capture. And they're very unhappy with me when my first question to them is, well, do you make it worth their while to come to class? Well, of course no, but you obviously don't, or they wouldn't do what they're doing, right? Now, there's going to be a subsection of students who never come to class no matter what you do. But if you're not teaching them in a way that they're getting something out of that interaction and that time, then why would they continue to come to class? So
Right. If I'm going to listen to a basically a monologue while there is a PowerPoint presentation in the background, it is actually more effective for me as a student, as a learner, to play that at my own speed, be
Mhm.
able to pause it, write down things,
Yes.
look up things as I
Yes.
go, etc., and then speed through
That's
the
right.
stuff that I already know. I'm just optimizing the amount of time that I have
Which you have
available,
to do in
which
vet
isn't
school
much.
because of
Yeah.
the volume of material that's
Right.
sent to you. So yeah, so I was not a great. I shouldn't say I wasn't a great student. I was a struggling student. It wasn't that I was too dumb, even though oftentimes I feel like the dumbest person in the room. I was just I was already a step behind because I was about 10 years older already. So your brain slows down a little bit. What you replace in
Mm,
speed, you gain wisdom,
right.
and that didn't really help me in vet school. So um, so anyway, yeah, I knew in vet school very early on that what I ultimately wanted to do was find a way to improve the quality of teaching that was happening in the classroom. Because to me, I say this to everybody, right?
Mm,
Like vet school is hard. It should be hard. It will always be hard. It doesn't need to be made harder by crappy teaching. And that's really what it comes down to, right?
right.
And again, that's not saying that the teachers are bad people or that they don't want to teach well. They just didn't have the tools that they needed. And so yes, at some point I knew eventually I was either going to be
Yeah.
a zoo and wildlife veterinarian, or I was going where I didn't have to deal with clients in the same way, or I was going to do something in education. And education sort of was always the thing that bubbled to the surface as my passion. But I knew that dealing with clients was going to make me very
Mm,
unhappy. I am by nature quite a strong introvert, actually. And so meeting strangers all day, every day was really difficult for me. And then I'm a fairly
mm,
sensitive person, and I've had to learn how to manage that as I've gotten older because dealing with crappy clients was also really, really challenging. And I think that's challenging for everybody. And I think a lot of people in veterinary medicine would say the same thing.
right.
And I really thought
Yeah.
and maybe this is naive, I thought that the euthanasia part of it and the part of dealing with clients who mistreated their patients at some point would get easier, particularly the euthanasia part, but the euthanasia part actually just kept getting harder and harder for me. Um, so yeah, I knew I wasn't going to,
Oh,
yeah, I
that's
knew I wasn't going to
interesting.
enjoy clinical practice. So,
I how so how I have a couple follow-up questions. So then why do you feel like it was getting harder over time? The euthanasia part in particular.
I don't know, actually. I think, I have a tendency to be a really, really empathetic person. And so I think that ability
Mm,
to distance myself emotionally from the individuals and from the patient, the animals, became harder for me as I got older. Um, but
right.
I don't know why that got harder for me. I wouldn't,
Hmm.
that, again, that's not something I anticipated. I really did not think that would become an issue, but it did.
Yeah, and I wouldn't expect it either. I mean, I'm sort of in the former camp where I feel like that part has
Yeah.
gotten easier. I mean, it's not I don't know, sometimes it's easy, right? Because you can justify it and whatever. And I'm not sure that it's like, hey, maybe it is because I truly believe like we're providing what
Mhm.
this animal or this family needs in this time. I think that like the emotional burden of it has gotten easier, but I will say that as like the numbers stack up and some nights, especially, I mean, I'm
Yeah.
an ER doctor, right? So like some nights
Yeah.
it's pretty bad. And those still do
Mhm.
take a toll, but I find that it's, so I'm
Oh,
not a
no, no,
complete
no.
sociopath yet, but but I but I have like decreased the amount of empathy that I have in those moments. I think
Yeah.
I don't know. It's one of the things I was actually really worried about when I was working a lot. I'm like, I don't know if I care about this
Mhm.
as much anymore, and I'm worried about what that says about
Yeah, no,
me.
I think that's interesting because I think it
So,
probably goes one
hmm,
way or the other, right? I think it either becomes much harder or it becomes much easier, and both have concerns. There are issues either way. I mean, either time you go to an
mm,
extreme. So
hmm,
I think that's probably a really interesting conversation, could potentially turn into a really interesting research project. Because I would be curious about that.
yes, I mean that's true, and I'm very curious about all that stuff. Yeah, the way that we survive this and our like survival strategies, I'm really curious about. It's one of the things that I ask people when I'm rounding, like between because when I do the overnights and I'm round to the next person, I'm always just sort of curious
Yeah.
about some of that stuff, like
Yeah.
how are you doing, and
I'm sure
any
they
tips?
appreciate you asking that. I don't think that
Like,
anybody, I did clinical practice for 13 years, ranging from day practice to urgent care to emergency care, and I certainly did some shelter adjacent type practice. I've worked in corporate practices. I've worked as a relief vet. I've worked in privately owned practices. I don't know that I ever had anybody ask me in those 13 years how I was doing when we were rounding. So I'm glad to hear that you are asking that. So that's good.
Wow. I mean, I don't know what we're supposed to do. Like, again, I mean, luckily, I do think I've gained a lot by not having previous clinical experience. So I just sort of enter it like a human being who like needs to ask the person how they're doing. You know?
Yeah.
Wow. So, I mean, then that brings up the second question, which is, or the second follow-up question is like, it's not like you like dabbled in practice for like a second and said, this is not for me, and then moved on. You practiced for a while.
I did. So
I suppose the question is, how
it
did
didn't
that
go well. I had $140,000 worth of student loans when I graduated from vet school. I did not have a family that was able to subsidize in any way my education. And so I had to subsidize it myself through student loans. And that's really ultimately what made the decision for me to go into practice. That was the only place that I could really make enough money to begin reliably paying off those student loans and have some semblance of a normal life. And it was a really big reason why I didn't go into do an internship or residency, other than the fact that I didn't think I was smart enough. But I just, I wanted to live a sort of normal human existence. And so it took me quite some time. I ended up actually getting divorced during vet school. And so, I was on my own when I graduated vet school, and I had to figure out a way to live. And that was the way to do it. And I'm really proud of the fact that I never killed anything I wasn't supposed to kill. And, I think there are lots of people out there who don't understand that, but people who are in the medical field do understand how sort of important that is to be able to say. And I love surgery. I love mentoring new graduates and talking to people who are young in the field, whether that's, veterinary technicians or veterinary assistants or kennel assistants, and just giving them, some ways that they continue to meet follow their dreams and potentially reach some of their goals. So I found pockets of places here and there where I had the opportunity to mentor individuals or teach or, do those types of things that really kind of filled my cup a little bit. But I actually only practiced full time before going back to school for 3 years. So I graduated in 2008 and I returned to school full time in 2011 to pursue my PhD. So and that was a whole nother sort of left turn that I didn't anticipate. But yeah, so I really used clinical practice to subsidize the life that I wanted to lead, which was getting that PhD in education and returning to find a way to make that impact.
Okay. That makes sense. I mean, truly, that's not that I just happen to like doing what I'm doing right now, which is a surprise to me as well as everyone that I went to vet school with, because I also was not somebody who was going to do clinical practice. But I mean, it also has a utility, which is I graduated with a lot of loans, like the 300 plus, variety. And then I want to do this, like the podcast stuff, and I want to write music, and there are expenses that come with some of that, and I want to be able to kind of do all of it on my terms, if that makes sense, instead of asking other people for funding. So it's like I'm subsidizing my own life by doing this thing. I just happen to enjoy it, but there is a utility and transactional piece of it as well.
I feel like you need to do a podcast about your life and journey, because it seems so fascinating.
That's interesting. I probably should. It's like, here you go, guys, if you want to know. There's so much. I mean, everything from, because all the things that I don't talk about, that never come up, like the delivering auto parts up and down the coast of California, when I was younger, I feel like all of that, I did a little bit of everything all along the way, including, collecting unemployment because I couldn't find a job in that 2008 period.
Sure.
I feel like all of it has sculpted who I am today.
Absolutely. Absolutely. People talk to me and they read my CV sometimes and they're like, wow, you have sort of a strange CV. I'm like, yeah. And everything I did on there led me to the moment to be here, right?
Exactly.
Everything that I did helped me become
Exactly.
who I am. So yeah, it sounds like it'd be a really
Yeah.
interesting interview. So you should interview yourself or have somebody
Who
interview
who
you or something.
who knows? Yeah, we could do I would love to do more like live events. Oh
Mhm.
man, that would be so fun. I that's it's in my sort of the ether. I just need someone to invite me to do it.
Yeah.
So
Okay.
it's hard to like show up at places like a conference and just like take over a lecture hall.
Well, I don't know. I think it could be done.
That all right. Let's do
Let's
it.
do it. Let's do it.
Yeah. I did want to what was I going to ask before shoot. Well, oh, that's what I was going to ask. So one of the things, and if you don't want to talk about it, that's fine. But obviously, but one of the things that I noticed in vet school is that it was real. Like relationships ended up being really hard, and a lot of the people around me who are in, especially who are in longer term relationships that existed before vet school, ended up having a lot of difficulty within vet school. Some of them split. You know, I was a part of that category. I almost made it 3 days until graduation.
Gosh,
But,
that's funny.
so, I mean, how do you feel? I mean, do you feel like the cauldron of vet school contributed to it? Was it already sort of kind of going that way? If you don't mind me asking.
No, no, not at all. So I think yes. I think there were, as with any relationship, it's complicated, and I think there were lots of things that contributed
Sure.
to it. So I do not have a great track record in romantic relationships, which I am currently married very happily, and we've been together for over 10 years, just putting that out there. Love you, John. But I think, my ex-husband and I were both military veterans. He had
Mm,
fairly significant time on the battlefield, and he did have some PTSD, and he was unable
mm,
to verbalize that or act upon that in a way that was healthy at the time. He was a few years younger than I was. He desperately wanted children, and I was not sure I wanted children. And we had had the conversation before I went to vet school that if I ended up going to vet school, the likelihood of us having children was pretty close to zero.
oh,
So yeah, I think there were a lot of things that were involved with that particular situation. I wouldn't call him a friend, but I would say that he's a friendly acquaintance still, and he's a
hmm,
good person. He really is a good person. I just think it was timing, a lot of emotional things that were going on with both of us. Vet school, as you know, it's just hard. I mean, anybody who tells you that vet school
hmm,
was easy is either a genius or lying, which means that most people are lying.
right.
And so I think, yeah, I think it was just a lot of that challenge. And I think there's an element of an inability to fully understand and comprehend what vet school is for somebody who's not there going through it. Um,
Right.
and that's not to say it would have been easier if he
Oh,
had been a student along with me. I just think that it's one of those things that it's kind of
yeah.
truly incomprehensible unless you actually go through it. Is my experience.
I have seen that. I mean, I've definitely seen that where because me and my ex, she was a year ahead of me because she went, and
Mhm,
then I'm like, oh, okay, and then I went the next year.
mhm,
So, but at least we did have sort of a shared understanding of
mhm.
what the experience was,
Yeah,
um, which helped. I mean, the way that we approached it was entirely different, and so I think that there was probably some strain related to that.
sure.
But it did help understanding the experience. However, I will say that a lot of the people that I'm thinking of are ones where yes, the spouse was obviously outside of vet school and just like couldn't like you can kind of see, oh yeah, you're busy, but it's like you don't quite understand. Like yeah, but I also literally can't do anything. Like I
Right.
like I
Yeah,
can't
yeah,
be the one to clean up the laundry, or I can't be the
right.
one to go do this chore right now. Maybe after tests, but that'll be 5 weeks from now. So it
Yeah,
just makes it difficult.
and that definitely exacerbated it. It was sort of one of those things where, I mean, I'm a woman, and unfortunately, in our society, women still, even with men who are quote unquote woke, however you want to put that, are feminists. Um, the bulk of household duties still fell to me. And I remember having many, many arguments about, I can't believe that you can't even just do the dishes for one night, because I would have to come home and have to do the dishes, or somebody would be he would be upset because the dishes hadn't been done. And it's like, well, then do the dishes your damn self, right? Like, I literally am in class 36 hours a day, and then I have another 30 or 40 hours worth of studying that I have to do. I don't have time to do the dishes, And again, he's a lovely human being. Those were the things that were, sort of, I guess, symptoms of what was going on.
It happens, and once, exactly. And once one thing happens, then it's sort of the next thing and the next thing, and it just kind of builds. And there's always this sort of tension that never really gets to be resolved because you don't have the time to like truly have that emotional conversation or the honest, earnest thing and do the actual work, or at least it's easier not to.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. I just remember one day I was sitting and I was talking to a classmate about, some strains. This must have been in clinics, because clinics was really hard for me. But we were talking about it, and then there were just other classmates nearby, and one overheard what we were talking about. She's like, "Oh my God, I'm so glad that you guys said that, because I felt alone in this, and I didn't know if I was doing something wrong." And so for anyone out there listening, you're not alone. I mean, it's
relationships are complicated on a good day. I mean, that's just, humans are weird, complicated parasites. And so, it's when you throw in something like medical school or veterinary school or dental school or even graduate school, it just becomes a whole nother level of complicated. So I think that's a really good point to make, is everybody's situation is different, but they're all complicated, and you aren't really alone when you're struggling with that. So
yes. Yeah, just turn to the person next to you, and they probably have a similar, experience in their history. So
yeah, for sure.
Well, all right. So, I mean, God, that must have been tough. And I remember for me, that sort of launched, that was, like I said, 3 days before graduation. So then everything that happened afterwards was sort of in that mode of figuring out, well, what the hell am I doing now?
Yeah.
This was, 12 years. And I went to vet school because I'm like, well, it's better to have a profession together than separate. Yeah. And so I didn't really know what I was going to do. So anyway, but I ended up doing this.
I mean, you end up finding your way, but I can't imagine 3 days before graduation. I mean, that's really tough. I'm sorry to hear that, because it sort of takes some of the joy out of reaching that milestone in some ways, maybe.
That's true. Yeah. I mean, it was hard. I mean, I'm sort of a forever optimist. And so even in those moments, I'm like, all right, we got this, we can figure it out. And so that's the next year was sort of trying to figure it out in some way, but it was just really difficult for a variety of reasons. But hey, I mean, we got through it, and for sure. And I'm definitely I know a lot more about myself and the things that I was sort of ignoring for years that I just wouldn't have known otherwise. So I'm also thankful for it as well.
Yeah.
It took a while to get there.
Yeah. It would be nice if it didn't take quite so much hard work and time, but I feel you on that. So.
Right. Exactly. So then, so you ended up back into the education thing, right? So like you got, you went into a PhD program, and then you are now doing education stuff. So like that seems like the thing that has always been like the passion in the back of your mind, and the thing that was sort of the driving force. So like, how are you doing now?
That is, that's a good question. I mean, there are good days and bad days. I'm in a role that I tell people oftentimes that I'm probably one of the few people who went into veterinary medicine and ended up right where I sort of wanted to end up. It took me a while to get here, which is understandable, and I obviously had a lot of left and right hand turns, but so I ended up right where I wanted to end up, which is an associate dean, an academic dean role, essentially, because I thought that this would be a role that would really allow me to make the kinds of impact that I wanted to make. And I'm finding that to be sort of somewhat true, but not fully true, right? So I still have to function.
Yeah, why?
Yeah, I mean, I still have to function within the academic system, which on a larger level is really far more political than you would like it to be, or that it really should be, but it is. I function within a system and a profession that, and you alluded to this earlier, that has sort of always done things this way and been successful, and is very slow to recognize that change is necessary,
Right.
even if it's scary, but it's very necessary. That evolution is necessary at a more rapid pace than they want to go, and so that's been a struggle. Um, and and I think that in some ways has made it difficult for me to sort of continue believing that I can make the impact I want to make, even as I do make an impact in other ways. And I have to remind myself of that. And I have lovely people in my life, including my husband, who reminds me of that.
Right.
So, there are days that I love what I do, and there are days that I hate what I do. And I think that's probably true of anybody, no matter what profession or what role they play in the profession.
Yeah. Which I
Have,
think is actually an important thing to sort of realize. Like so I started writing. It's again about a year and a half ago. Like seriously sitting down and writing every day and doing the thing. And it's something that I don't know, maybe I have romanticized so much of my life, and I'm like, man, if I could just sit and write, I'll be satisfied with, whatever. As it turns out, it's also a lot of really hard work.
yeah.
It's like some days you love it. Some days the phrases come in just as you want them. They land on the page and you're like, magic. And some days you're just sitting there, you're just trying to rent just something, just put something down. It's so frustrating.
Yeah, it's so true. My dad actually thought I was going to be a writer when I grew up. So it's another thing we could probably have lots of conversations about. But I think it's just like anything, right? Like some days you love it, some days you hate it. I'm really lucky that I have a really fabulous team of people that I work with on a daily basis. They're hard workers. They know what they do. They appreciate me. I appreciate them. We have a good time together. We can do things sort of as people as well as coworkers. And I think that's one of the things that I really love about my job and makes it a little bit easier on those hard days to come into work, to know that I have that group of people around me. I have a really supportive boss. Again, he's my boss. I don't always agree with what, the decisions he makes, but I mean, it would be a boring world if we agreed with our bosses all the time, right? So I think we challenge each other in good ways. But I work at a large land grant institution, and it's a fairly white male centric institution, as most institutions are. And so I do have challenges from that perspective. I mean, your listeners aren't going to know this, but I'm an Asian woman, and that makes it a little bit more challenging for me to get things done and be heard in a way that's taken seriously. In spite of all of the training and credentials and experience that I have. So that's just the way it is in the world. I have to constantly sort of reassess my way of thinking about things, because I was raised in a different system and in a different world than the students that are coming into school these days. They have different sort of, their values aren't different, but I think the way they approach things and think about things are different. And there are some things that are really easy for me, right? So being sensitive to the fact that, gender is a pretty fluid thing, and that there are some people who don't identify with the gender that they were potentially born into. To me, I'm a fairly socially liberal person. That's a pretty easy thing. Some of the things surrounding ideas about, well, I'm a first-year vet student, I should get to have a say in every decision that's made. I have really struggled with that, right? Because I grew up in a very authoritarian kind of society, a very authoritarian time. And while I don't agree that everything should be made from an authoritarian perspective, there are things that I'm like, that's not how it works in the world, right? It feels like it's
sit down and take notes, buddy.
It's not, right? Sorry, we're not going to change our entire semester schedule because you want to go to your sister's wedding. It's just not going to happen, right? And learning how to sort of to say that in a way that doesn't sort of make them like, anarchy, but helps them understand that, sometimes you don't get to control your destiny. And so, I think those are things that I struggle with on a regular basis. But I still love students. I love faculty a little bit less, but they can be more difficult than students. I think the main thing is that, and I'm very lucky because I came into my role at a time when we really needed to sort of look at our curriculum, and that's what I love, right, is curriculum. And so we're in the process of doing some curricular review and making some suggestions as to how we might improve the curriculum that we have. We have a good curriculum. It's just a matter of making some tweaks that make it a little bit better. And so that's exciting to me. So there are opportunities to do it, but the professional development on the individual level, I really miss being able to sort of impact it in the ways that I used to in my earlier career.
Yeah, I could definitely see that because that's one of the struggles that I have because I love, I mean, education is something that I've always had a passion for. And I think it actually is born out of it's a thing within me where I never really knew what I wanted to do. But if I could enable someone else to do what their dream was, then I felt really good about that.
Yeah.
So like even in, and I've said this before, but it's like even in vet school, I taught MCAT prep for Kaplan. Like that was the thing that I did at the end of the day. And it rejuvenated me. Like it gave me life again so that I could go back and sit through another day of PowerPoint lectures.
Yeah, I feel you.
So yeah, I could, but I will say that, during the, well, anyway, so being in front of people and affecting people on a kind of more individual basis, you can sort of see the light bulbs and you can see the trajectory shift and all of that. That is really rewarding to me. Whenever I create content or something that is somehow educational, but then goes out into the world and I never see the result of, I have a lot harder of a time feeling really good about that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that makes sense. I mean, earlier, my first foray into academia was in public health, and I taught public health for almost 9 years. And I loved my public health students. I miss that desperately. But what I did for my last few years in that job was actually do one-on-one mentoring with faculty. And so I was provided the opportunity by the dean at the time to use some of my FTE allotment to go have conversations with faculty, talk to them about what are your struggles, what can I help you with? And it was anything from syllabus construction to creation of assessments to evaluating those assessments to giving student feedback to them. And I worked with well over 40 faculty in that time on an individual basis. And I was, sort of the mentor and touch point, the educational expert, if you want to call me that at that point. And I was becoming pretty well known as somebody that was willing to do that and able to do that. And, I worked with lecturers sort of all the way up to professors who had been professors for 40 years. And some of those 40-year professors were not quite as amenable to the conversations, but I could always find something, sure. Right? There was always a way to find something, some way to help them make a change. And so for one example, we had gone to Canvas, which is a pretty common learning management software system. And this individual just did not want to use Canvas. They had been told they needed to use Canvas multiple times, multiple years. And it turns out that they had been told they needed to use it, but had never been given the tools to understand how to use it. And so when I figured that out, I was like, oh, well, there's this Canvas specialist that you can go to on campus and just set up an appointment with them. They can get you all taken care of. And that individual made that appointment, ended up having a monthly appointment with that person for the entire semester and finally started using Canvas, right? Like nothing else about that class changed. I mean, there were lots of things that needed changing, but I got that individual to change one thing. And so that was really rewarding. That's what I really miss. And my area of interest is really in that professional development, helping faculty be better at what they do in the classroom. And that sometimes is well received and sometimes isn't. And that's the challenge.
Right. Yeah. That's, have you noticed any patterns? I suppose if I'm thinking about it, I'm like, well, the ones that have been there the longest are probably the ones that are going to be the most resistant. Yeah. The ones that are like young and whatever are the ones that have optimism and, like, yeah, we can change the system. I mean, have you noticed the patterns like that, or is that just something I'm making up?
No, I haven't. I mean, not that I've sat down and really taken notes on it or done research into it, but I think, I have noticed, so my dissertation actually looked into sort of this idea of what are people's attitudes towards the discipline of education. And it was specifically, science instructors at the university level. And I think I'm a qualitative researcher for whatever that's worth. And what I discovered in those stories was that, again, I think the vast majority of people who come into the higher education system, I will say this. I think there are a lot of people, and this may be true more of the sort of higher R1, really high research, right, institutions. Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm.
That I do think that there is sort of this idea from students that professors oftentimes are in the classroom because they have to be, not because they want to be. And I think that,
Right.
based on my N of 10, I think that that really truly that more often than not, that's not true. I think that more often than not, the professors who are teaching, they do want to teach. They've just not been given the tools to know how to teach well. And they also have so many competing pressures, as you alluded to earlier, that teaching becomes the thing that gets pushed off to the side because it's the least rewarded, right? If you bring in a $30 million grant, you're much more likely than to get tenure and be rewarded than if you teach 3,000 students and they all pass their NAVLE, right? And that's just the way our system is set up. So, so I think, to answer your question, I think the pattern that I found is that most people actually do want to teach well. They're just not given the tools to do that. And it doesn't matter if they're somebody who's been teaching for 40 years or somebody who's just going into the classroom, that as a group, they want to teach well, and they just aren't given the tools to do that. And I don't think it matters what age or stage of your career you're in.
You know, that actually reminds me. So as our clinical, basically when we were in fourth year, we were supposed to do this like roast video presentation type of thing, where the idea traditionally is that you end up roasting the professors or maybe other students or, you know, whatever. What I got sort of put in charge of it, or maybe I volunteered. I don't know. I just needed something that wasn't clinics.
You were volunteering.
But yeah, exactly. But my bent on it was that it was more of like a roasting of the veterinary school experience. And one of the things that I wanted to do, and so at the end, and I actually say this at the end, but it's like at the end, I wanted the sequence to be what are the clever ways that like residents and interns and professors found to like call people dumb. Like what are the most clever ways that they did that?
Yeah.
But like, and so I interviewed a bunch of people. I thought it would be. But what I actually found, and I say this in the thing, is like you just find that it's just a bunch of people who are trying their best in a system that's somehow, or like sometimes just not made for it. It's like sometimes rigged against it.
Yeah.
And truly, I did find that when I was talking to all these professors, that throughout the years, I was like, well, this is not somebody who's interested in education. They just, you know, they come in, they give the same slide that they've given for the past 30 years or whatever. And truly in having those conversations, I realized the same thing. It's like, these are people who are actually really passionate about the student and they want the student to succeed and are really welcoming. It's just like, they may not necessarily know how to be a great lecturer or how to, you know, engage students or whatever.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah, absolutely.
For whatever that's worth.
It's worth a lot, I hope.
I hope so.
Yeah.
So do you find that, so I was curious about because you have a podcast that you're a part of. So this Reflections in Veterinary Education. And is that like this little touch point of like joy to you where it's like you get to nerd out of this thing that you actually really love, where you can talk in the philosophical or in the hypothetical and the, you know, whatever, the optimism, and not have to deal with the like realities of how do we make this change?
Yes and no. So as I've already said to you, I am very strongly an introvert. And so every third Thursday of the month, it gets to be about 7:00 and I'm like, oh, I have to do this podcast. And then I get on there and it's like wonderful, right? Because I love my colleagues and we have these great conversations and I get to nerd out about education. But yeah, so there's always that little bit of a dissonance. But yeah, I mean, the short answer is it's super fun. I love Eric. I love Bobby. They're amazing individuals who have their own really interesting lives and stories to tell. And we all get to nerd out over education. So it's pretty cool.
That's cool. That's awesome. It's always fun to like find the thing that I don't know, that you get to nerd out over. I feel like that there's always that one thing, at least in your life, where you're just like, I love this for whatever reason.
Yes.
That's amazing. So looking back, because you have there's a lot about your story that we haven't talked about. I mean, you've kind of done all of these other things, which, by the way, I think that you were at LMU right after I was, because I did a teaching fellowship that ended in 2019. So
wait a minute, were you the Civic teaching fellow?
I was, yeah.
Yes, I came in right after you. They finally hired me right after you left. And then do you know Micah Simons by any chance?
No, I don't
Okay.
think so.
Well, she's actually a small animal residency trained surgeon who came on into the fellowship role after you. So she was the second fellow, but we actually ended up converting her to a faculty member. But yeah, so.
Oh, cool. Yeah, man, I wanted that to be, I was so excited about all of that. But as I alluded to earlier, like that was the time that my life was in tumult. So, so
Yeah,
like
yeah,
I wasn't able to provide the attention that I, wanted it to. But yes, it was amazing. And I'm still very thankful for that experience.
that's
But
awesome.
anyway, when we so when you look back on sort of all these things that you've done, I mean, work wise or not, I mean, what are some things that you're like, actually this was super fun, I really enjoyed doing this, or whatever was super rewarding, what do you miss, that type of thing?
In terms of like clinical practice or just career wise
No,
or
I mean just in terms of just a moment in your life where you're like, man, that was super. So I will, like as an example, maybe for myself, is that there was when I was in college, there was this job that I took. It was at a JCC for some reason, but there was like a preschool attached,
Mhm.
and there was a kid who was, I want to say 5 at the time, who was autistic, and then it was just me kind of hanging out with this kid, and that was my job. It was like, so I got to basically effectively like coordinate play,
Mhm.
but mostly it was just like hang out with this kid during playtime, make sure that like he has somebody with him, blah blah blah, and that
Yeah.
was it. And it was just like, for whatever reason, it wasn't that long of a position. I think I was only in it for about 6 months before like the school year ended, and I went on to do other things. But it was like, that was such a fun, neat, odd, rewarding piece of my life.
Uh,
So has nothing to do
yes.
with clinical medicine, but
Yeah.
I don't know if there's anything like that for you, which is just like, this moment was just so interesting and rewarding. And uh,
Hmm. I'm not sure I've ever sat and reflected on that. I think there are lots of those moments in my life that there's probably more than I could probably recount, honestly. And this is maybe going to sound a little bit strange, but I had, um, so I've already alluded to the fact that I had not a great upbringing. I was adopted
yeah,
by an American couple who divorced when I was quite young, and then my mother had custody because that's what happened in the 70s. And unfortunately, she was an
right.
abusive woman. And so I was raised with a narrative that was told to me by primarily my mother, that sort of shaped how I thought about myself and how I thought about who I was and the type of person that I thought I was. And when I was doing
Mm,
my volunteer work at the Humane Society during my second attempt at getting an undergraduate degree, so this was when I was on my ROTC scholarship. So I was volunteering at the Humane Society, and there was a veterinarian there whose name was Dr. Rhodes, and she was this tiny little woman, just a very, very sweet, smart, capable veterinarian, right? Just a really nice person.
mm,
And I remember that we
mm,
were standing in the surgery suite, and I was very proud of myself because I'd been there long enough that I could actually prep a kitten and get it ready for her before she actually was ready to have the kitten, because she was so fast
yeah,
in the surgeries,
yeah.
And so we were just having sort of this conversation, and she had casually sort of asked me about my hands because for anybody who knows me, I have bilateral burns to both my hands. And so she'd asked me
Mm,
about that, and she said, "Well, have you had any complications?" So I sort of told her the story, and I was like, "Oh yeah, I had surgery on my right thumb in fourth grade because my muscle contracted." And she said, "Oh well,
mm,
did you have any complications from that? And why did your muscle contract?" And I was like, "Well, I didn't do my physical therapy when I had the initial burns. And now, keeping in mind, my initial burns happened when I was 18 months old, right?" I was like, "Well, I didn't do my physical therapy,
uh,
and so my muscle contracted, so I ended up having to have this surgery later." And she was like, and she just kind of gave me this look, and we hadn't worked together for a long time at that point, but she just sort of cocked her head to the side and she looked at me and she said, "What do you mean you didn't do your physical therapy?" I was like, "Well, I had these exercises that
yeah.
I was supposed to do, right? And I didn't do my physical therapy, so my muscle
Mm,
contracted." And like any normal human being, would be like, yeah, what the hell, right? Like you were 18 months old. There's no way you were going to do those physical therapy exercises on your own, right?
Yeah.
But I had been told my entire life that my muscle contracted because I had failed to do my physical therapy. This is how I was raised. Right. And so I had internalized this idea that somehow at 18 months, I was supposed to be capable of doing my own physical therapy exercises. Right, sure. And I was, I think, 26 or something when I'm having this conversation, right? And she just sort of looked at me. She's like, well, don't you think that's a little unfair? And I was like, well, I don't understand what you mean, right? And she's like, I mean, you are 18 months old. Do you think that any 18-month-old is going to actually do physical therapy on their own? And it was literally this moment in my life where I was like, wait a minute, right? Like, it was this Gestalt moment. And it sounds ridiculous to anybody who's listening to this. They're like, oh, this person must be a complete idiot, right? But when you're told your entire life this narrative from the time that you're very young, you don't know any better. Like, you don't know that your parents are or not. You just assume that your parents are telling you the truth, right? And so, I mean, in my mid-20s, I had this moment of just like, wait a minute, my whole life I've been told something, and now it's taken this somewhat stranger who's a very nice person to sort of come in and wake me up and say, no, you've been living in this alternate reality, and this is the truth, right? This is the truth. And I think it was one of those moments where I finally realized that was sort of the beginning of, fortunately, the beginning of the end of my relationship with my adoptive mother, because it allowed me to understand that I was not beholden to this woman, and that this woman had told me things that were lies, and that I didn't have to believe them anymore. Right. And so it was a really, it sounds like very depressing, but in retrospect, it was a really freeing moment. It was one of those moments where you just, it's literally that aha moment where you're like, oh my gosh, I can live my life and not be under this sort of shadow of guilt and wear this umbrella all the time of, keeping the rain off of me, because now I realize that this is not my problem anymore. So I'm not sure that's what you were looking for, but that I think is what
that's
comes to my mind.
That's way better than my answer.
No, not at all.
No, I'm just, that's fantastic. I mean, so first off, thank you for sharing. But and then, I mean, you're absolutely right, and that is I guess I would say like an extreme example of something that I think is true for all of us, which is that when we grow up, we have certain understandings or expectations of the world, and how we relate to that world, that only in time, if we're lucky, if the right people kind of cross our paths, are we able to shift that perspective.
Yep.
So you're not alone in that either. There's just a fantastic example of it.
Yeah. So I didn't work with her.
I'm glad that happened.
But yeah, she was a lovely human being, and it was definitely one of those things that I'll never forget. So.
Wow. Well, gosh, this was great. I'm like so happy. I know that we're out of time, but it's like I have so many questions, but that's good. And thank you for sort of taking the leap and doing all this with a complete stranger, which is me.
Well, that's all right. That's okay. Sometimes you got to take the leap. Otherwise, why not? Plus, I mean, I guess they can like look me up, but they aren't going to see me talking about it. They're just going to hear me. So.
Well, we'll see. I mean, I can post these on YouTube as well.
I see. Okay. Right.
Yes. As it turns out, I have them all up on YouTube, but no one's really watching them there. So I don't know. But whatever. That's where they're going.
On YouTube too. I don't know that anybody watches them. It's fine.
Who knows? People always keep saying, put it on YouTube. That's where they watch podcasts. I'm like, not according to the stats.
I know. And it's a podcast, right? Not a vodcast, but whatever. So.
Right. Yes, I've never once actually sat in a room just staring at a screen of two people talking. I'm like, I listen to these on the road. That's the point.
That's right.
So
yeah, agreed. Man. Well, this has been fun. Thanks for sharing stuff and.
Absolutely. Any other lingering questions or things you want to impart before we say goodbye? I don't want to cut you off.
I mean, I could say all kinds of things, but I'll save that for another time. No, it's been really fun.
Well, ladies and gentlemen, stay tuned for part 2.
Yeah, you may not be willing to invite me back. You'd be like, as long as you're not in the office and people don't keep interrupting you.
That's
No, no,
better.
it was very
No,
nice.
it adds a little bit of reality, and I love it.
Yeah,
So,
right. She must not be very busy if she can do the playoffs. Actually, caught me at a really good time because we're getting ready to be really busy. So I'm taking advantage of the fact that we have a little bit of downtime. No, I
that's
guess I
great.
would just say, if you ever run across a hungry hippo game, you should stop and ask the person about it because you just never know where it's going to lead. I mean, it could be great. And I think I told you
It's
this,
great
but the
advice.
reason I stopped was because, I have this nonprofit and we had just gotten back about a month before from our trip and we had a couple that was new and they were looking for a hungry hippo game because some of the Kenyans that we had talked to, they were trying to talk to them about it and they had no idea what it was. And so they're like, well, we're going to find a hungry hippo game and we're going to send it to you. So that's, for your listeners who are
Right.
completely confused, that's why I stopped at the booth because you had a hungry hippo game. And I was like, oh, I'm taking a picture. And now here I am.
Now here you are. That's amazing.
Yeah, it was great.
Well, thank you for being here. Thank you for stopping. Thank you for being enraptured by the hungry hippos.
I was,
So
yeah, good work.
yeah, awesome. It was great talking to you. Thank
It
you.
was great talking to you too. Thanks so much for having me.
And that was my conversation with Dr. Katherine Fogelberg, Dean Fogelberg. What is happening? just I'm just a curly-haired, bearded fella in a split-level home with all of my Tintin posters and paintings behind me, with my rock opera poster sitting above me, talking to deans and casually putting them out into the world for consumption. I don't understand. I don't know what's going on. So yeah, that was Dr. Fogelberg, Dean Fogelberg. I love that. And man, I was so one thing that I'm just so blown away by and grateful of for many of my guests is just their willingness to share things that, this is not an exploration of, and then what did you do? And then how many years were you at that job? And what skills did you learn there? This is not that. This is people telling stories from their lives and going to vulnerable places sometimes to complete strangers to put out into the world. And I think that's really great and part of what I really love about it and what I feel like, again, the feedback that I'm getting is what people are connecting to. So I'm so grateful for it and very appreciative of it. And I was reminded of that again in this conversation. So I will try to cajole her to come back and kind of fill in some pieces here and there. I would love to know more about the nonprofit. It seems to be like the culmination of all the things, and we just didn't get to it. So, but yeah. Thank you guys again for listening. If you have any questions or comments or anything like that, again, if you go to the website, thegreatestprofession.com or tgppod.com, there is an email link there. You can just shoot me some questions, comments. If you have any questions for any of the guests, you can throw those in there too. I can always try to get back in touch with them and try to answer some of those questions. So any of that stuff, if you need anything from me, you just let me know. I'm around. I'm here. What do what am I doing? Just raising a family. Yeah. So, which by the way, Luca is doing well. He is sleeping a little bit better. He refuses to eat meals. He's a snacker. He's quite light. Made out of titanium. He's just a little fella, but but boy, is he adorable. So that's what I'm doing right now. Again, if you guys are going to be at IVEX, I shall be there. Shoot me a line, swing on by. I'm not going to have a booth. I'll just be around. So maybe if you just see these luscious locks floating through the exhibit hall, stop me and just be like, "Hey, what the hell is wrong with you?" Anyway, thank you again for listening. Thank you to Dr. or Dean Fogelberg for being a part of this. Man, I just so appreciate it. And with all that said, may you remember to cover your grill in time before the storm comes. that might be also based on a true story. Anyway, anyway, it's quite wet out there. I don't know what's happening. This is supposed to be a high desert. I live in a marsh. Uh, Thanks again, guys. And until next time, I hope you guys are doing well out there. All right. Bye.